The hole was already 8 feet deep when Estelle Vance rode up in her husband's wagon and asked what in God's name was going on. Nora Whitfield didn't stop digging. The shovel bit into the Nebraska prairie soil hard at the surface, softer below, and she lifted another load of dark earth onto the growing pile beside her. The pile was nearly as tall as she was now. She had been measuring her days in dirt. Estelle sat up straight on the wagon bench, her iron-gray hair pulled tight against the October wind, her expression arranged into the particular combination of concern and authority that she wore whenever she felt the community needed her guidance, which was often, which was nearly always. "Mrs. Whitfield." Nora drove the shovel into the earth, lifted, turned, released. "Mrs. Whitfield, I am speaking to you." "I hear you, Mrs. Vance." "Then kindly explain what you are doing." Nora looked up for the first time. Her face was streaked with dust. Her hands, wrapped in worn leather gloves that had been her husband's, gripped the shovel handle with the steadiness of someone who had been at this work for hours and intended to continue for hours more. "Digging," she said. Then she went back to it. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a woman who was not accustomed to being answered with a single word and then ignored. Estelle Vance sat in that silence for a long moment, her mouth slightly open, recalibrating. "I can see that you are digging," she said finally. "The question is why. That hole is already deeper than any man in this settlement stands tall. You are not building a well. There is no water table here worth chasing. You are not digging a cellar. You already have one attached to the soddy. So I will ask you again, and I would appreciate a complete answer this time. What are you doing?" Nora stopped. She leaned on the shovel handle and looked up at Estelle Vance with the patience of someone who had made a decision weeks ago and no longer felt the need to defend it to anyone, but who also understood that some conversations once started were easier to finish than to outrun. "I am building a bedroom," Nora said, "underground, for me and my daughters." The silence this time was different. It had weight to it. It had the specific texture of a mind encountering something it had no existing category for and refusing on principle to create one. "An underground bedroom," Estelle repeated. "That's right. You intend to sleep in a hole in the ground." "I intend to keep my daughters alive through a winter that I do not believe the settlement is prepared for," Nora said. "The bedroom is part of that preparation." Estelle stared at her for a long moment. Then she climbed down from the wagon, carefully, because Estelle Vance did everything carefully, everything deliberately. Everything in the way that communicated she was a person of standing and did not rush, and walked to the edge of the hole and looked down into it. It was a serious excavation, that much was undeniable. The walls were clean, the corners squared as well as a person could manage with a shovel working alone, the depth impressive in a way that inspired unease rather than admiration. Estelle looked at it the way people look at things they have already decided are wrong, but cannot immediately explain why. "The cold will come up through the ground," she said. "You will freeze faster underground than you would in the soddy with a proper fire." Nora shook her head, not impatiently, with the steadiness of someone who had already considered this objection and moved past it weeks ago. "The ground doesn't get cold," she said. "Not deep down. 6 feet below the surface, the earth holds the same temperature all year round. 54 degrees in summer, 54 degrees in winter. It doesn't matter what the air does above. Down here, it doesn't change." Estelle's expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession. Disbelief, dismissal, a flicker of something that might in a more open person have been curiosity, but which in Estelle Vance hardened almost immediately into the expression of someone who has been told something that contradicts their understanding of the world and has chosen as a matter of character not to accept it. "That is not possible," Estelle said. "It's the way the earth works. Ask anyone who has dug a deep well. Ask a miner. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. My daughters will sleep at 54 degrees while the blizzard above does its worst." "A blizzard," Estelle said. Her voice carried the tone of someone addressing a child who has said something imaginative but disconnected from reality. "Mrs. Whitfield, it is October. We have had cold before. We survived it." "You have had Minnesota cold," Nora said quietly. "Most of the families in this settlement have. Prairie cold is different. Prairie cold comes with wind that does not stop for days. Snow that buries houses to the roofline. Temperatures that will freeze the spit in your mouth before it reaches the ground. I am not building this room because I am afraid. I am building it because I have done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic says that a sadi with a stove is not enough when the real cold comes. The wind moved across the prairie between them. The dried grass made its sound. The sky above was the particular shade of pale that October carries on the Great Plains, a color that is not quite blue and not quite gray, a color that seems to have already begun the long process of becoming winter. Estelle Vance drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable. "I will pray for you, Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "and for those poor girls." She climbed back into the wagon. She did not look back as she drove away. Nora watched her go. Then she pulled the shovel free from the earth and went back to work. She had a bedroom to finish. Edmund Whitfield had drowned in September. The river had been running fast from 3 weeks of upstream rain, and the crossing had looked passable. It always looked passable from the bank, which was the thing about rivers, the way they showed you a surface and kept their power hidden underneath. The wagon had broken loose in the current, pulled by the weight of everything they owned, and Edmund had gone in after it the way he went after everything, without hesitation, without calculating odds, with the particular kind of courage that does not stop to ask whether courage is the appropriate response to the situation. He did not come back up. Nora had been standing on the bank holding Della and Wren, 4 years old, small enough that she could hold one in each arm, which she had done, which she had needed to do in order to keep herself from going in after him, and she had watched the river take her husband and refused to return him. They had been 3 days from the claim, 3 days from the 160 acres they had filed on. 3 days from the house Edmund had already planned in his head, the garden Nora had already laid out in hers, the life they had spent 2 years working toward, from a rented room in St. Paul, where the walls were thin and the winters were long, and Edmund had spread the land maps across the kitchen table every Sunday evening and traced the boundaries of their future with his finger. The other settlers at the crossing had been kind. The women had taken Della and Wren. The men had organized a search downstream that found nothing. Someone had said prayers over the river, which seemed to Nora like praying at a wall, but she had bowed her head because that was what you did, because there were forms to these things, and the forms mattered even when nothing else made sense. They had expected her to turn around. Everyone had expected her to turn around. Go back to Minnesota, find her family, or find another situation, or find some other future that did not involve a widow alone on the Nebraska prairie with 2 4-year-old girls and no man to file the paperwork and work the land and do all the things that the territory assumed a man would do. What they did not know, what no one in the settlement knew except Nora and a land agent in town named Silas Brandt, who had pulled her aside 3 days after Edmund's burial and spoken to her quietly while the other settlers moved around them oblivious, was that the law was more complicated than it appeared. A widow could inherit her husband's claim. Not automatically. Not simply, but if she improved the land before the 1st of April, if she could demonstrate to the land office that the claim was being actively worked, that she intended to stay, that she was building something, then the claim would pass to her. Legally, permanently, 160 acres of Nebraska prairie hers for as long as she chose to work it. Failed to improve it, and the land went back to the government, available for anyone else to file on. Gone. Silas Brandt had told her this the way a man tells a woman something he is not certain she can handle, carefully watching her face for signs of collapse. He had not found any. What he had found, if he had been paying close enough attention to name it, was the precise moment when a person who has been falling catches hold of something and stops. Nora had thanked him. She had gone back to her sadi. She had put Della and Wren to sleep in their shared bed and sat at the table for a long time in the lamplight looking at her hands. Then she had gotten up and found Edmund's saddlebag. He had carried it across 2 states, that bag. Brown leather worn smooth at the corners with a brass buckle that had always given him trouble. Inside were the things he considered important enough to carry on his person rather than in the wagon: their marriage certificate, the land filing documents, a letter from his mother he had never shown Nora, but also never thrown away, and a small notebook. Green cover pages filled with Edmund's handwriting, which was cramped and earnest and had never quite shed the look of a schoolboy trying to impress a teacher. She had known the notebook was there. She had not opened it since he died. She opened it now. Most of it was what she expected. Land measurements, soil observations, crop calculations, the kind of careful accounting Edmund had applied to every aspect of their migration west. But near the middle, written in a slightly different hand than the rest, as if he had been writing faster than usual, or writing in low light, or writing with some urgency she had not been present to observe, there were 2 pages she had not seen before. He had written them during the journey. After a night they had camped alongside a man traveling east, going back, he had said after 20 years of going west, a man with the hands of someone who had worked underground and the eyes of someone who had seen things he intended to spend the rest of his life forgetting. They had talked for hours around the fire. Nora had been tending to the girls. Edmund had listened. The man's name was never written down. What Edmund had written down was what the man told him about the earth. 60 feet down in any mine on this continent, the temperature holds steady regardless of season. 52 to 55 degrees, depending on latitude and soil composition. Miners know this, well diggers know this. The earth maintains its heat from the core outward, and the surface fluctuations the summer heat. The winter cold penetrate no more than 15 to 20 feet in any direction. Below that threshold, the earth does not know what season it is. Below that threshold, the earth keeps its own counsel. He says if the winter gets bad enough that a cabin stove cannot keep pace with the wind, the answer is not more wood. The answer is less exposure. He says the plains winters can kill a man in an open field in 20 minutes. He says the same winter cannot touch a man 6 feet underground. He says he has seen it done. He says he has survived it himself. He says if we are smart, we will remember this. Nora had read those pages 3 times. Then she had gone to bed, and in the morning she had started digging. The work was harder than she had anticipated and more straightforward than she had feared. The prairie soil had a surface layer dense root-tangled resistant that required serious effort to break through. But below that first 18 inches, the earth opened up. It was darker down there, richer, with a smell that was not unpleasant. That was in fact the smell of something ancient and patient and indifferent to human schedules. It came up on the shovel in heavy loads that she learned to pace herself against, working for an hour and resting for 15 minutes, drinking water from the jug she kept at the edge of the hole, eating the bread and dried meat she brought out each morning. Della and Wren watched from the doorway of the soddy. They were alike in the way that only identical twins are alike, not just in the shape of their faces and the color of their hair, which was Edmund's dark brown, lightened by the summer sun, but in the quality of their attention, the way they observed the world with a seriousness that seemed unlikely in 4-year-olds, and that Nora recognized as something they had inherited from their father, who had always looked at everything as if it might teach him something he needed to know. But they were not alike in everything. Della had from the first morning looked at the growing hole in the ground the way a small animal looks at something it cannot categorize and therefore cannot trust. When Nora climbed down into it, Della would come as close as the edge look over and then step back, her face tight with a feeling she did not yet have words for, but which Nora recognized as a kind of visceral refusal. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. Something the body knows before the mind has any say in the matter. Wren was different. Wren would sit at the edge of the hole for long stretches, legs dangling, watching her mother work below, asking questions with the relentlessness that 4-year-olds treat as their natural right. What does it smell like down there, Mama? Like dirt, Wren. What kind of dirt? The good kind. Is there anything else down there? Just me? Can I come down? Not yet. Why not yet? Because I'm still making it safe. How will you know when it's safe? I'll know. This satisfied Wren for approximately 4 minutes. Then, Mama, is there anything else down there? She had learned to love these conversations the way you learn to love the things that are hard and also necessary. Wren's questions kept her company in the long hours. And the contrast between Wren's curiosity and Della's resistance, the way the hole that represented safety to Nora represented something very different to her quieter daughter, sat in her chest as a weight she carried alongside the physical weight of the work. She was building a shelter for 2 children who had opposite feelings about it. One of them would need to trust her completely. She hoped she was worthy of that trust. The community's reaction had a shape to it, and the shape was predictable. First came the looking. Neighbors who happened to ride by, which was not entirely accidental, which involved a small detour that everyone pretended they hadn't taken, and slowed their horses near the growing pile of excavated earth and looked at it with expressions ranging from puzzlement to concern to the particular kind of judgment that is dressed up as concern but smells, if you get close enough, like something else entirely. Then came the talking. Nora heard the edges of it when she went to town for supplies. Conversations that did not quite stop when she entered a room but reorganized themselves, shifted in register, became about something else. She heard her name once clearly from behind the dry goods counter, and then heard it not said again, which was its own kind of sound. Then came the delegations. Estelle Vance had been the first because Estelle Vance was always first when it came to representing the community's concerns, and because she had appointed herself to that role in the unspoken but thoroughly understood way that certain people always do, not through election, not through any formal process, but through the sheer accumulated weight of having opinions and expressing them loudly enough and consistently enough that everyone gradually comes to treat them as the community's opinions rather than their own. After Estelle came Reverend Howell, who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with the careful expression of a man who believes he is doing someone a kindness and would prefer not to have that belief challenged. He stood at the edge of the hole. It was 10 feet deep by then, 12 feet wide, the shape of the room becoming clear, and looked down at Nora working below. And he said what he had come to say, which was that the community was concerned about her well-being, that grief took many forms, that there was no shame in accepting help, that the ladies of the church had discussed the possibility of her and the girls staying with the Alderton family for the winter, which was a fine family with a sturdy house and plenty of room. Nora listened to all of this from 10 feet below ground level. Then she said, "Thank you, Reverend Howell. I appreciate the concern. I am not grieving in a way that requires intervention, and I am not going to stay with the Aldertons. I am going to stay on my land. Please give my regards to Mrs. Howell." She went back to digging. Reverend Howell stood at the edge for another moment, searching for additional language, and then found he had none and left. The following week, Nora noticed that Della and Wren were no longer playing in the yard with the Prescott children who lived on the adjacent claim and had been the girls' primary companions since their arrival in Nebraska. She did not ask about this immediately. She watched for 3 days to be certain she was reading the situation correctly. On the 4th day, she walked to the Prescott soddy and knocked on the door. Margaret Prescott answered. She was a kind woman, ordinarily the kind that was genuine rather than performed, that showed up in small, practical ways rather than large, declarative ones. But there was something in her face when she opened the door that was not unkind, but was also not the face of someone who was entirely comfortable with the conversation she could see coming. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Mrs. Prescott, my girls have been wondering about your children." A pause. "We have been keeping them closer to home lately," Margaret Prescott said, "the weather turning and all." The weather was in fact as mild as October on the Nebraska prairie gets. Both women knew this. "I see," Nora said. Another pause. Margaret Prescott's hands moved against each other in a small washing motion that she seemed unaware of. "People are worried about you," she said finally. "That's all it is. They don't mean anything by it. But there are children involved, and when people see children, they worry. And when they worry, they—" "I understand," Nora said. She did understand. She understood completely. She understood that fear travels faster than reason, and that it is easier to quarantine the source of fear than to examine it. And she understood that Estelle Vance was not the only person in this settlement who found the sight of a widow digging a large hole in the ground unsettling. And she understood that unsettled people make decisions that are not always their best ones. She also understood that she had a room to finish and a deadline that did not move, and 2 daughters to keep alive through a winter that the prairie had not yet revealed, but that she could already feel at the edge of things in the quality of the wind, in the way the light had changed in something that was not yet cold, but was the memory of cold, the promise of cold, the cold that was still 60 days away, but was already writing itself into the air. "Please tell your children that Della and Wren miss them," she said. "I hope they will be able to play together again soon." She walked back to her hole and went back to work. It was mid-November when Estelle Vance returned with reinforcements. 3 women this time arriving in 2 wagons, as if this were a social call, which it was in the way that inspections are social calls, in the way that judgment dressed in visiting clothes is still judgment. They stood at the edge of the completed excavation, and it was by any measure a serious piece of work. The main chamber was finished 12 feet square, 7 feet deep, the walls reinforced with scrap lumber that Nora had sourced from a collapsed barn she had located 15 miles south, hauling it back in loads over the course of a week. The entrance tunnel had been carved at the angle she had planned from Edmund's notes, horizontal for 4 feet, then sloping down at a gentle grade for another 6, so that the tunnel turned a corner before opening into the chamber, ensuring that cold air could not fall directly into the living space the way it would fall into a straight vertical shaft. There were 2 doors. The first was at the surface, a heavy wooden hatch hinged and latched, covered with a layer of sod that matched the surrounding prairie. When it was closed, it was nearly invisible. You had to know where to look. The second door was at the bottom of the tunnel, where it opened into the chamber, a lighter construction of canvas stretched over a wooden frame which would hold heat without blocking the passage of air. The floor was raised 6 inches on a platform of logs, creating an insulating air gap and keeping the sleeping surface above any water that might seep in during the spring melt. Nora had covered the platform with layers, straw first, then canvas, then the quilts she had brought from St. Paul, which were good quilts, the kind made to last, the kind her mother had made, with the understanding that the things you make should outlast your reasons for making them. The ceiling was 4 layers, logs close set, canvas, 6 inches of straw, 2 feet of sow. The weight of the earth above compressed everything below, and the whole assembly was, by any structural standard Nora had been able to reason through, more than sufficient for its purpose. She had moved the essentials down already: lamp and oil, a week's worth of food, the chamber pot, the box that held Edmund's letters, and the land filing documents in the green notebook. A small locket of Della's hair that she had saved from the child's first haircut, and the same from Wren. The soddy above would remain the daytime living space. The room below would be the refuge. Estelle Vance looked at all of this and said nothing for a long moment. "Then you're going to raise your daughters down there. I'm going to keep them alive down there. In a hole in the ground, like animals." Nora met her eyes, like people who understand what a Nebraska winter is capable of. One of the other women, a younger one recently arrived from Ohio, stepped back slightly from the edge of the tunnel opening, as if proximity to it carried some risk she had not fully assessed. The third woman, who was older and had been watching Nora more carefully than the other 2, said nothing at all. "You've never seen a prairie winter," Estelle said. "You are making preparations based on a fear you have invented from stories." "I am making preparations based on physics," Nora said. "The Earth holds 54 degrees, 6 feet down. The blizzard holds whatever temperature it chooses to hold above. My daughters will be at 54 degrees. Your children will be in a soddy with a stove that may or may not be able to keep pace with 60-mile-an-hour wind. Those are the facts. The winter will settle the argument." The silence after this was the silence of a woman who has said something she cannot unsay and is watching it land in the air between herself and someone she had expected to have the last word with. "I'll pray for you," Estelle said finally. She said it the way you say it when you mean something else entirely. The women left without going underground. They left without saying anything kind. They climbed back into their wagons and drove back toward the settlement, and Nora stood at the edge of her entrance tunnel and watched them go and felt something settle in her chest that was not anger and was not satisfaction, but was the particular quiet that comes when you have stopped waiting for permission from the people who were never going to give it. She was alone on her land. She had a room underground that could hold her family through anything the winter chose to throw at Nebraska. She had a deadline, the 1st of April, and a legal right and a plan. And she had somewhere in the back of her mind a voice that was not quite Edmund's, but that carried his cadence, the careful, deliberate accounting he had always applied to everything that mattered. And what the voice was saying was simple. It is not enough to be right. You have to still be standing when the winter is done. Then everyone will see. She looked up at the November sky. The color of it had changed since October. The particular pale blue was gone. What was there now was something lower, heavier, a sky that seemed closer to the ground than it had any right to be, a sky that was making its intentions clear in the slow, patient way that weather makes its intentions clear to anyone paying attention. Something was coming. She did not know exactly when. She did not know exactly how bad. She knew that she would be ready for it in a way that the people who had come to judge her would not be. And she knew with the same certainty she had felt in the lamplight on the night she read Edmund's notebook the certainty that had carried her through 6 weeks of digging and hauling and building and being talked about and being looked at and being prayed for by people who meant it as an insult. She knew that she had done the right thing. She had built what Edmund had written down. She had finished what they had started together. Whatever was coming from the north, from Canada, from wherever the worst of it was already gathering itself, it would find Nora Whitfield underground, with her daughters at 54 degrees waiting. Old Clem found her 2 days after Estelle Vance's inspection. He came from the east riding a horse that looked like it had been borrowed from a decade that had already passed, a gray animal with a Roman nose and the slow, deliberate walk of something that had long ago made peace with the distance between where it was and where it was going. The man on its back was of a similar disposition, white mustache, thick and unkempt, catching the November light. Hands that had the particular texture of leather left out in too many seasons. Eyes that had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by it, but not enough to have stopped being interested. He pulled up at the edge of the excavation and looked down into it for a long time without saying anything. Nora was below, working on the tunnel entrance, the last major piece of construction, the part that would determine whether the cold air stayed out or found its way in. She heard the horse. She heard the creak of the saddle. She did not stop working. "That's a serious hole," the old man said finally. "It is," Nora agreed. "Kuan, you planning to sleep down there, me and my girls, during storms and through the worst of the nights?" Another long silence. He dismounted with the careful economy of someone whose joints had opinions about sudden movements, tied the horse to the fence post Nora had set at the edge of her claim, and walked the perimeter of the excavation the way a man walks the perimeter of something he is actually looking at rather than just seeing. His boots moved through the dry November grass with a sound like paper tearing slowly. He crouched at the northwest corner and looked at the angle of the tunnel entrance. He was quiet for long enough that Nora climbed out of the hole and stood beside him, following his gaze. "You've got a problem," he said. "Show me." He picked up a stick from the ground, the kind of man who always seems to have a stick available when one is needed, and traced the angle in the air above the tunnel opening. "The way you've got it angled, cold air will fall straight down into the chamber like water into a barrel. Cold air is heavy, it sinks. You put a hole in the ground and angle it the way you've angled this one, you've built yourself a funnel for the worst of what comes from outside." Nora looked at the tunnel. She looked at the stick. She looked at the tunnel again. "How do I fix it?" He stood up slowly. "You angle it sideways first, horizontal for 4 feet before it drops. Then the drop. So the cold air has to change direction to find its way in, and cold air is lazy. Cold air does not like to change direction. You make it work to enter, and most of it will go around you instead. And the doors. 2 of them. One at the top, one at the bottom. You've got one at the bottom already, which is right. You need a heavier one at the top. Wood, not canvas. The 2 doors together create an air gap, a space where the temperature can transition before it reaches the chamber. Without that gap, every time you open the top door, you let winter in directly." Nora was quiet for a moment, working through the construction implications. "I'll have to dig out this section and regrade it," she said. "Yes. That's another 3 days of work, at least." "Yes. But it's the part that matters most." "It's the only part that matters," the old man said. "You can have the finest underground room in the state of Nebraska, and if the entrance is wrong, all you've built is a cold box with nice walls." Nora looked at him directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "You know something about this." It was not a question. It was the observation of someone who recognized in another person the specific weight of knowledge that has been earned through experience rather than accumulated through reading. The old man's name was Clement Purdy, though no one in the settlement had called him anything other than Old Clem since approximately the year he turned 50, which had been long enough ago that he no longer remembered the exact date. He had come to Nebraska from Missouri, which he had come to from Arkansas, which he had come to from Tennessee, which was where he had been born, and which he had left at 19, with the particular conviction of young men who believe that every good thing is located somewhere other than where they currently are. He had been wrong about that mostly, but the traveling had taught him things that staying put does not teach, and one of the things it had taught him was what the ground knows that the air does not. 30 winters on this prairie," he said. "Survived most of them the way everyone else does in a house next to a fire hoping the wood holds out. But the winter of 64, he paused, not for dramatic effect, for the reason that certain memories require a pause before you can carry them out into the open air. The blizzard of 64 came down from Canada with nothing to stop it between there and Texas. Temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Wind at 50 miles an hour for 4 days straight. He looked at the entrance to Nora's tunnel. I was 2 days from the nearest settlement. My horse went down in the first hour. I dug a hollow in the side of a creek bank, covered it with my bedroll, and what branches I could find, and crawled in. Spent 4 days in that hollow while the world above me turned into something I would not have believed was possible if I had not seen it. How warm was it? Nora asked. 52 degrees, maybe 53. I know because I have a miner's thermometer that I carried then and still carry now from a habit that saved my life and that I see no reason to break. He looked at her steadily. Men died in cabins during that storm, Mrs. Whitfield. Good men. Men with proper fires and stacked wood and walls between themselves and the wind. They underestimated it. The earth did not underestimate anything. The earth simply held its temperature and let me live. Nora said nothing for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass around them, carrying the first real edge of what was coming, and not yet the cold that would define the winter, but the advance notice of it the scout sent ahead to let the land know what was on its way. You came here to help me fix the tunnel, she said. I came here because I rode past 3 times this week and watched you working, and I could see from the road that the angle was wrong, and I could not in good conscience ride past a 4th time without saying something. Well, why didn't you say something to saying the first 3 times? The old man looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same region of the face. I needed to be certain you were serious, he said. Serious enough that the information wouldn't be wasted. Nora picked up her shovel. I'll start on the tunnel today, she said. Will you come back tomorrow and check the angle? I'll come back tomorrow, he said, and the day after if needed. He untied his horse. He mounted with the same careful economy as before. He looked down at her from the saddle with those eyes and that had stopped being surprised but not stopped being interested. The floor, he said, raise it 6 inches on a log platform. Air gap underneath. Keeps the cold from seeping up from below and keeps you above any water that finds its way in come spring. I had that planned already, Nora said. He nodded. Good, he said. Then you're further along than I thought. He rode away to the east, the gray horse moving with its slow, deliberate walk, and Nora stood at the edge of her tunnel and looked at the angle of the entrance with new eyes, measuring what needed to be undone and what needed to be rebuilt, calculating time and materials and the number of daylight hours remaining before the light became too thin to work by. She had 3 days of reconstruction ahead of her. She picked up the shovel and started. She learned who Clement Purdy was in pieces over the course of the days he came back. He never stayed long. He was not, it became clear, a man who believed in making a production of his presence. He would arrive in the late morning, look at what she had done, identify the thing that needed adjusting, say it plainly, and then either stay to answer questions or leave if there were none, depending on what seemed useful. He knew the earth the way certain people know a language they learn before they learn to speak. Not as a system of rules, but as a texture, something felt rather than analyzed. He knew which soils were stable under load and which would shift when the freeze-thaw cycle ran its course. He knew how deep the frost penetrated in a Nebraska winter and why 2 feet of sod on the ceiling was the right number. Not 1, which was insufficient, not 3, which was unnecessary weight. He knew the relationship between the height of a sleeping platform and the movement of cold air which settled and pooled like water, finding its level, and why you wanted your body above it. He delivered all of this the way a man delivers things he has known so long, he has forgotten that other people don't know them. Without preamble, without the performative patience of someone who enjoys the sound of their own explaining. On the 3rd day, when the tunnel had been rebuilt and both doors had been installed and the floor platform was in place, he came down into the chamber for the first time and stood in it for a long while without speaking. The temperature underground was already noticeably different from the air above. Not dramatically, the insulation was not yet fully tested and the sod ceiling was still settling, but there was something in the quality of the air, a stillness, a consistency that felt less like warmth and more like the absence of the assault that the wind conducted on every surface above ground. It will hold, O'Clem said. The temperature? The structure, the temperature will take care of itself. He looked at the ceiling, running his eye along the join between the log beams and the sod above them. The ceiling is the most important piece. Yours is well made. It was by any standard she had been able to apply the most direct compliment she had received in 2 months. There was a family, and he said. He was still looking at the ceiling. His voice had shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but with something removed from it, the way you remove the edge from a knife when you want to use it for something delicate. Name of Pruitt, father, mother, 3 children, settled on a claim about 12 miles north of here, winter of 1864. Nora waited. I knew them from the summer, helped them source timber for their soddy, sat with them a few evenings. Good family, careful people. He paused. When the blizzard came, I was already underground. I had tried to tell them what I knew about the earth, about the temperature, about the way the ground holds what the air cannot. I told them imperfectly. I was younger and I did not yet understand that incomplete information is sometimes more dangerous than no information at all. He came back to looking at her now. They built a shallow pit, about 3 feet deep, not enough to reach the stable temperature, enough to feel like they were doing something, enough to give them confidence they had not earned. He stopped. The blizzard lasted 4 days. When it broke, I went to check on them. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The chamber was quiet around them. Somewhere above the wind was moving through the November grass, making it sound. You are not telling me this to frighten me, Nora said. No. You are telling me why you came. I am telling you why I could not come, he said. There is a difference, Sheos. She understood the difference. She understood it the way you understand things that involve the other people's grief. Not completely, not with the full weight of it, but enough to know what it cost him to say it plainly, and why saying it plainly was the only kind of respect worth offering. The tunnel is right now, she said. The depth is right. The ceiling is right. Yes. Then what you told the Pruitts is not wasted. Old Clem looked at her for a moment with the eyes that had stopped being surprised by the world, but had not stopped being interested in it. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. He climbed out of the chamber and rode away, and Nora spent the rest of that afternoon bringing down the last of the supplies, the lamp and the extra oil, the carefully rationed food, the things from Edmund's saddlebag that she would not risk losing to whatever the winter decided to do to the soddy above. She placed the green notebook at the center of the wooden box. Then she climbed out, closed both doors, and stood on the prairie above her room and tried to imagine that she did not know it was there. She could not see it. The sod hatch was indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. The tunnel entrance graded and covered showed nothing. The room below existed in a different dimension from the world above. It protected not by walls or locks, but by the fundamental properties of the earth, by physics, by the same logic that had kept Clement Purdy alive in a creek bank while the world above him ended and remade itself. She walked 10 feet away. She walked back. Still nothing. Just the prairie, brown and dry in the November cold, and the sky above it, and the wind across the top of the grass. She had made a room that the winter could not find. Gideon Vance passed her land on horseback for the first time in late October. She noticed him the way you notice something that happens once and means nothing. A neighbor riding along the boundary of his own claim, taking stock of things before winter set in. Normal enough. She had not thought about it. The second time was in the first week of November. She was working on the sod ceiling, which required her to be above ground, and she saw him from a distance, a figure on a brown horse moving parallel to her property line, at a pace that was, she thought, slightly slower than practical travel required. He did not stop. He did not wave. He looked, and then he rode on. The third time was the week old Clem came. She was inside the tunnel regrading the angle, and when she came up for water, she saw Gideon Vance's horse standing still at the edge of the road 50 yards away, Gideon himself looking directly at what she was doing with an attention that was not casual and not accidental. Their eyes met across the distance. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, that acknowledged without committing to anything. And then he rode on. Nora set down her water jug and thought about what she had seen in his face in that moment of acknowledgement. Not mockery, not concern, not the particular combination of pity and disapproval that had become the default expression of most people in the settlement when they looked at her. Something more like calculation. The expression of a man who is looking at something and running numbers in his head. She filed it away. She had a tunnel to finish. Estelle Vance kept her distance through most of November, which Nora interpreted correctly not as a retreat, but as a regrouping. The inspections had not achieved what they were meant to achieve. The conversations had not landed. The praying for had not produced the appropriate response, which would have been gratitude and compliance. Estelle was not a woman who abandoned campaigns. She was a woman who changed tactics. What she did not do in any of this was talk to her husband about what he had seen on those 3 rides past Nora Whitfield's land. And what Gideon Vance did not do, though, he had opinions about the matter and had formed them carefully over the course of those 3 observations, was volunteer the information. This was the particular arrangement of their marriage. Estelle was the voice of it and Gideon was the mind of it. And they had each over 20-some years come to a working understanding that these roles were not interchangeable. Estelle spoke. Gideon thought. When the thinking and the speaking aligned, everything was fine. When they didn't, and they didn't always, Gideon had learned that the most efficient path forward was patience and silence, and the private maintenance of his own conclusions. He had his own conclusions about the underground room. He kept them to himself. The night changed things as nights often do. It was the last week of November, late after the girls were asleep, Estelle in her chair by the fire with her mending, Gideon at the table with the accounts he was trying to make come out differently than they insisted on coming out. The fire was burning well. The cabin was warm enough. Outside, the wind was doing what the Nebraska wind does in late November, which is to remind you, in case you had forgotten, that the walls between you and it are less substantial than they appear. Gideon, he looked up from the accounts. Estelle had set down her mending and was looking at the fire with an expression he had seen before, the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been arguing with herself about for longer than she was going to admit. Does the ground actually hold its temperature the way she says? A pause. Not because he didn't know the answer. He knew the answer. He had known the answer since the second time he rode past Nora Whitfield's land and stopped to watch her work and started to understand from the angle of the tunnel and the depth of the chamber and the careful layering of the ceiling what she was actually building and why it would work. The pause was because the answer he had was not neutral. The answer he had pointed somewhere, and Estelle had always been particular about the direction things pointed. There's science to it, he said carefully. The Earth's temperature is fairly consistent below a certain depth. It's known. Miners know it. Well diggers know it. Estelle was quiet for a moment. So she's not... No, Gideon said. She's not wrong about the science. Another silence. The fire popped. The wind pushed against the north wall of the cabin with a sound that was, if you were paying attention, slightly more purposeful than last week's wind. Estelle picked up her mending. I see, she said. And then she said nothing else. Gideon looked at her profile in the firelight, the iron gray hair, the particular set of her jaw, that he knew as well as he knew his own name, the expression that had closed itself back up like a book being shut before the last page. She had asked the question. She had heard the answer. And now she was deciding not to follow it where it led, because following it where it led would require a conversation that Estelle Vance was not prepared to have with anyone, including herself. He recognized this. He had seen it before. It was not stubbornness exactly, or rather it was stubbornness, but it was the kind that grows from something real, from the investment of having been publicly certain, from the weight of having assembled other women and ridden out to inspect and declared and prayed for. To reverse course now would not be a private change of mind. It would be a public dismantling of everything she had built around the certainty. Estelle could not afford to be wrong about Nora Whitfield, so she chose not to be. Gideon went back to the accounts. He thought about the tunnel entrance and the angle of it, and the 2 doors and the raised floor platform and the ceiling with its 2 feet of sod. He thought about the family he had known in Missouri 30 years ago, who had built a similar room, less refined, less deliberate, but based on the same principle, and survived a winter that had killed a third of the county. He thought about Estelle's question, which she had asked and then walked away from. He thought about his 3 children who were asleep in the back room. He did not say anything else that night, but some things do not need to be said in order to change the shape of the decisions waiting ahead. The room was finished in the last days of November, and the last days of November on the Nebraska prairie have a quality that is unlike anything the months before them contain. The light is different, lower, thinner, coming in at an angle that makes everything cast longer shadows than it should, that makes the afternoon feel like early evening and the morning feel like something borrowed. The wind is different too. It has found its winter register by late November, that particular sustained note that is less a sound than a condition, less something you hear than something you feel in the bones of your face and the backs of your hands and the space between your shoulder blades where tension lives. Nora moved the last of the supplies underground on the 28th of November. She stood in the chamber afterward, lamp burning low, and took stock of what she had built. 12 feet by 12 feet. 7 feet of clearance from the raised floor platform to the lowest point of the log and sod ceiling. 2 doors, the heavy wooden hatch at the surface, the canvas door at the tunnel's base. The walls solid and dry, showing no cracking at the joins between the scrap lumber and the earth. The temperature by old Clem's thermometer, which he had lent her, and which she had placed on a hook near the center of the room, 54 degrees. Exactly 54. She thought about Edmund, who had written it down in a green notebook in the flickering light of a campfire, listening to a man describe the way the earth held its warmth against everything the sky could throw at it. She thought about the care with which he had transcribed those pages, not Edmund's usual cramped shorthand, but something more deliberate, as if he had understood that he was writing something that would matter more than the words themselves. Below that threshold, the earth does not know what season it is. She thought about the crossing and the river, and the particular way that the current had taken him, not violently, not dramatically, but with the terrible indifference of a force that does not know you are there. She thought about the 1st of April, which was 123 days away, and the land office in town where Silas Brandt would be waiting to record her claim improvement and the 160 acres above her head that were by law and intention and the work of the last 2 months becoming hers. She turned the lamp down to its lowest setting. The chamber was dark, 54 degrees. Still, above her, 12 feet away and a world apart, the Nebraska wind was doing what it had always done and would always do, indifferent and relentless, absolute in its indifference. It did not know about the room. It could not reach her. She climbed back up through the tunnel, through the 2 doors, and out into the cold above. The morning of the 12th of January, 1874, began like a dozen mornings before it. Nora was up before dawn, as she always was. She got the fire in the soddy going, the stove that kept the daytime space livable, that she no longer trusted with her nights, and heated water for the girls' breakfast, and thought about the day's work, which was, now that the room was finished, the ordinary work of the claim, the animals, the woodpile, the small, relentless maintenance of a life in progress. She went outside with the water pail at first light. She stopped. The sky to the northwest was the color of a bruise, not the soft purple-gray of an ordinary overcast morning, but something deeper, something with intention behind it, a darkness that was moving. The horizon in that direction had disappeared. What was there instead was a wall pale at its leading edge, the particular white that is not the white of clouds, but of everything at once, of snow and wind and sky collapsed into a single advancing thing. She knew what she was looking at. She had never seen it before with her own eyes. But old Clem had described it, the wall, the way it swallowed the distance, the speed of it, when it finally reached you. Edmund's man at the campfire had described it. The history of this prairie described it in the language of the families who had been here long enough to have experienced it and survived to name it. A blizzard, the kind that came from Canada with nothing to stop it. She stood for 3 more seconds reading the sky with everything she had learned in the 2 months since she had started paying the kind of attention that the prairie demands if you intend to live on it long term. The sun was up now, barely a pale disk behind the advancing overcast. Around it, almost perfectly circular, was a halo. Refracted light through ice crystals high in the atmosphere. A ring around the sun meant moisture at altitude, which meant the system was large and loaded and had not yet begun to deliver what it was carrying. The cattle in the small pen to the south of the soddy were standing still, facing south. All of them. She had learned from old Clem what this meant, not superstition, not folklore, but the animal response to a pressure change and a wind shift that the nervous system detects before the conscious mind does. The air itself had a quality she had no word for, a compression, a holding. The kind of stillness that is not peaceful, but preparatory, the stillness of something drawing a breath before it speaks. She went inside. Della, Wren, get up. Bring your quilts. Della, who startled easily, was on her feet before Nora finished the sentence. Wren opened one eye. Is it morning? It's time to go underground. Get your quilts and your boots. Wren sat up suddenly, fully awake in the way that children become when something interesting has entered the situation. Is the storm coming? Yes. The big one? Nora was already pulling on her coat, checking the lamp oil, loading the food into the carry basket she had kept packed for exactly this purpose. The big one? Come on. Wren was out of bed in one motion. Della was already at the door with her quilt around her shoulders, looking at Nora with eyes that asked the question her voice hadn't formed yet. We're going underground, Nora said, meeting Della's eyes. It's going to be all right. I built that room for exactly this morning. Della nodded a small, serious nod that belonged on an older face and waited. They went through the tunnel in order, Nora first with the lamp, then Wren, then Della last, and moving carefully. Nora sealed the lower door. She climbed back up, alone, took one more look at the northwestern sky. The wall was closer now, close enough that she could see it was moving faster than she had estimated, close enough that the leading edge of wind had already found the grass and was bending it in long waves, and she pulled the upper hatch down and latched it from inside. She descended the tunnel in darkness for the last few feet, opened the lower door, and stepped into the chamber. 54 degrees, the lamp caught. The chamber filled with its warm orange light. Wren was already sitting on the sleeping platform, looking around with the expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere interesting. Della sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, her quilt held around her with both hands. Nora set down the lamp in the basket and sat between her daughters. Above them, 12 feet of earth and timber and sod. Above that, the sky was beginning its work. She could hear it already, a low, sustained sound that was not quite wind, as she knew wind, but something larger than wind, something that contained wind, the way the ocean contains waves, something that was going to continue regardless of anything that existed beneath it. The chamber held its temperature, 54 degrees. Nora put an arm around each of her daughters and thought about the 1st of April, which was 78 days away, and the land that was above her and around her, and already in every way that the law would eventually confirm hers. She thought about Estelle Vance, who was somewhere above, in a soddy she had stacked with firewood, and trusted to the same stove that serviced every other winter, ordinary and extraordinary alike. She thought about Gideon Vance, who had ridden past this hole 3 times and looked at it with the eyes of a man doing arithmetic. She thought about old Clem in his cabin to the north, who she hoped was where she expected him to be, who had given her the angle of the tunnel, and the depth of the floor platform, and the thickness of the ceiling, and the specific knowledge that had come from a hollow in a creek bank, and 5 dead members of the Pruitt family, and 30 years of understanding what the earth keeps and what it gives away. Above her, the storm hit the settlement. She felt it not as cold, not as wind, not as any of the things it was doing to the surface world above her, but as a change in the quality of the sound. The low, sustained note had found its register now. It was no longer the sound of something approaching. It was the sound of something arrived. Wren leaned against her left arm and looked at the earthen ceiling with clear, interested eyes. Della leaned against her right arm and closed her eyes and stayed very still. Nora looked straight ahead at the opposite wall of the chamber at the scrap lumber, reinforcing the earth at the thermometer hanging on its hook in the center of the room. 54 degrees. The storm did not know they were there. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. The storm did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way serious things arrive, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of escalations, each one establishing a new baseline that made the previous level seem almost bearable by comparison. The first hour was wind. The second hour was wind and snow. By the third hour, the two had merged into something that was neither wind nor snow, but a single condition, white erasure that moved at 60 miles an hour and did not distinguish between the things it buried and the things it destroyed. Underground, none of this was visible. What Nora could perceive of the storm above was sound, and the sound came to her filtered through 12 feet of earth and timber and screen until it was something she could only barely identify as related to weather. A low vibration, a sustained pressure against the world above her ceiling. The distant muffled howl of something enormous moving fast, heard the way you hear a train from 3 counties over present, unmistakable and entirely without the power to touch you. The temperature held. She checked it every 2 hours. 54 degrees. 54, 54. The thermometer old Clem had lent her hung on its hook in the center of the chamber and reported the same number with the consistency of something that has no interest in drama. The earth below and around her was doing what it had always done, what it had been doing since before anyone walked across it, what it would continue doing long after the last settler packed up and left or died trying to stay. It was holding its temperature against everything the sky chose to do above it. Wren adapted to the underground the way she adapted to everything new with appetite. She explored the dimensions of the chamber systematically, on the first day running her hand along all 4 walls, measuring her height against the ceiling, clearance finding the corners, and the joins between the lumber reinforcement and the earth. She discovered that the earthen wall on the north side was slightly damp, and that if you pressed your finger into it, it left a mark, and she spent a productive hour pressing her finger into it in a pattern that she announced with complete seriousness was a map. A map of what? Nora asked. Of down here, Wren said, so we remember it. Della stayed close to Nora. Not clinging Della was not a child who clung, but proximate, within arm's reach. She slept more than Wren did, which Nora understood as the body's response to anxiety, the way the mind, when it cannot find peace, settles for unconsciousness as the next best option. When she was awake, she was quiet and watchful, her eyes moving around the chamber with the systematic attention that she had inherited directly from Edmund, that quality of looking at everything as if it might require a response. On the afternoon of the first day, Della said, "Mama, is the storm very bad up there?" "Yes," Nora said. "It is." "Are people in trouble?" Nora looked at her daughter, 4 years old, with her father's serious eyes and the particular quality of his questions, not the curiosity that Wren expressed, which was oriented outward toward the world's surfaces, but a curiosity oriented inward toward what things meant. "Some people may be in trouble," she said. "We are not. Because of the room." Because of the room. Della considered this. "Did you know the storm was coming when you built it?" "I knew a storm like this would come eventually. I didn't know exactly when." "But you were ready." "We were ready." Della nodded. She looked at the thermometer on its hook, read the number, and then looked at the ceiling. 54 degrees, she said in the tone of someone confirming a fact they intend to keep. 54 degrees, Nora agreed. The lamp oil was her primary concern. She had brought 4 full vessels, which she had calculated would last 6 days at the burn rate she had established during her preparation evenings. But calculation and reality have a way of diverging when the variables include 2 4-year-old girls who preferred the lamp at full brightness, and a mother who was trying to balance their comfort against the possibility that the storm lasted longer than anticipated. She kept it at half. She told the girls it was because she liked the way the shadows looked at half brightness, which was partially true. The chamber at half lamp was a warm amber space softer than full light, the earth walls catching and holding the glow in a way that was unexpectedly beautiful. She told herself that if the oil ran low, they would simply be in darkness, and darkness at 54 degrees with 2 quilts was not a catastrophe. She told herself this with the particular firmness of a person who is getting ahead of a fear before the fear gets ahead of them. The food she had packed was simple and sufficient. Dried meat, hard bread, dried apples. A sealed tin of molasses that Wren discovered on the second day and treated as a personal windfall. Nora portioned it carefully, not because they were in any immediate danger of running short, but because portioning things carefully was the habit of someone who understood that the distance between sufficient and insufficient is shorter than it looks, and that the time to manage that distance is before you are standing at the edge of it, looking down. She slept in shifts, not intentionally. Her body made the decision for her 4 or 5 hours, then awake, then the checking of the temperature and the lamp and the breathing of her daughters, then the slow return to sleep, then the cycle again. In the long stretches of wakefulness, she thought about the claim, about the 1st of April, about Silas Brand at the land office who had told her what was possible and then stepped back to watch whether she would make it possible. She thought about Edmund's notebook, which was in the wooden box 3 feet from where she slept, and about the 2 pages in the middle that had led her here underground warm while the world above endured what it was enduring. She thought about what she would do with the land when it was certified. The garden she had planned, the same garden she and Edmund had laid out together in the rented room in St. Paul, on a piece of paper that she still had, that had survived the river crossing and the burial, and everything that had come after. A garden to the south of the Sadi where the light was best. Potatoes and turnips in the ground beans on a fence line. The small domestic ambitions that look ordinary until you understand what they cost to achieve. She thought about Della and Ren growing up on this land, going to whatever school the settlement eventually established, learning to read the sky the way she was learning to read it, knowing in their bones and without thinking about it that the earth keeps its temperature 6 feet down regardless of what the air does above. She thought about the things you pass on to your children that are not lessons exactly but orientations, the way you face the world, the questions you think to ask, the things you notice when other people are not looking. Edmund had given her some of that. Old Clem had given her some. The rest she was making herself here underground in the amber light while the storm moved through its catalog of extremes above her. The knock came on the third day. It was faint, she almost missed it. A sound from above that was different from the sounds the storm made, that had a pattern to it, a human pattern. 3 distinct impacts against the wooden hatch separated by deliberate intervals. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand up. "Stay here," she told the girls. She went up the tunnel in the dark, no time for the lamp, moving on memory the horizontal section, and then the slope, the canvas door, and then the wooden hatch. She pushed against the hatch and met resistance. Snow. More than she had anticipated. She had expected drifting, but not this weight, not this solidity, not snow that had packed itself against the hatch and frozen there in the hours since the storm's temperature had dropped to what she estimated from the sound of it was somewhere below 40 degrees below zero. She pushed harder. The hatch gave 2 inches. Cold air hit her face like a wall. She turned her face away and pushed with her shoulder, and the hatch moved 6 inches, 8 a foot. And then she could see the sky, or what passed for sky, in the middle of a blizzard, which was an indeterminate whiteness that had no top and no bottom and no direction, only intensity. A shape in the whiteness. A man bundled into something so layered and wrapped that he was barely recognizable as human. Snow on every surface of him. His face visible only in a narrow gap between a pulled-down hat and a scarf wrapped to his nose, and in that gap, the skin was the particular red of someone who had been in this temperature long enough to cause damage. She knew the hat. She knew the coat. She had seen them passing her land 3 times in the fall, each time slower than the one before. Gideon Vance. "Inside," she said immediately. "Get inside." He was already moving toward the hatch, already half crouching to find the tunnel entrance. His movements stiff and effortful, in the way that cold makes all movement stiff and effortful when it has had enough time to work on a body. She guided him to the opening. He could not have found it himself, not in this, not with his eyes reduced to survival-width slits. And he went in, and she followed him and pulled the hatch closed above them and latched it. The sound of the storm vanished. The tunnel returned to its dim quiet. She could hear Gideon's breathing, ragged, shallow. The breathing of someone whose body has been doing emergency maintenance and hasn't yet received the signal that the emergency is over. She got him down to the chamber. The warmth hit him visibly. His legs, which had been moving with the rigidity of something mechanical, suddenly had difficulty with the last 2 steps, and she caught his arm and held it until he found the floor platform and sat down heavily. "How bad is the cabin?" she asked. She was already at the lamp, turning it up. He took a moment before answering, working his jaw, establishing that his face was capable of the movement speech required. "Stovepipe cracked," he said. His voice was hoarse from breathing cold air. "Yesterday morning, smoke backed up into the cabin. We tried to manage it, but by afternoon it was—" He stopped, coughed. "Estelle and the children are in the barn. The barn is tight, but the temperature in there is—" Another stop. "I don't know how long it can hold." "How many?" "Estelle, 3 children, 974. Nora was already thinking through the space. 8 people in a room built for 3. It would be close. It would be significantly less comfortable than the last 3 days had been. And it would be fine because the temperature would hold, whether there were 3 people in the room or 8. And the food she had packed for 3 could be rationed for 8 for 2 days without anyone going hungry. And 2 days was all they needed because the storm was going to break when it broke, and there was nothing to do about the timing except be in the right place when it did. Can you go back out? She asked. Can you get Estelle and the children to this entrance? He looked at her. His face, as the chamber's warmth began to work on it, was returning to something more like its natural expression, which she had seen 3 times from a distance and read correctly as the expression of a man who thinks carefully and speaks sparingly. I can go back out, he said. I know the way. Straight north from the barn, 50 yards. The hatch is flush with the ground, you'll have to feel for it. I'll come up to meet you. He nodded. He sat for another 2 minutes, letting the warmth do what it needed to do. Then he stood. Della was watching him from the sleeping platform with Edmund's eyes taking inventory, reserving judgment. Wren said, Are you cold? Not anymore, Gideon said. It's 54 degrees down here. Wren told him with the authority of someone delivering important information to someone who needs it. He looked at Nora. In his face in that moment, she saw something that she recognized as the conclusion of a process that had been running in him since the first time he slowed his horse on the road past her land, since the second time when he had stopped entirely and looked with the eyes of a man calculating, since the third time when he had touched his hat brim and ridden on without stopping, carrying whatever he had concluded inside him to a house where the conversation he needed to have was not available to him. She asked me, he said, Estelle, the night before the storm, she asked me if the science was real. Nora waited. I told her it was, he said. I told her the earth holds its temperature. I told her what I knew, which was what I had watched you build for 6 weeks from the road. She didn't come, Nora said, not as an accusation, as a fact. No, Gideon said. She didn't. A pause. The chamber was quiet around them. The storm was a whisper from 12 feet above. I memorized where the hatch was, Gideon said. From the road, the angle of it relative to the fence post, the distance from the soddy. I told myself I was being practical. He stopped. I was being practical. You were, Nora said. He went back up the tunnel and out into the storm. Estelle Vance came down the tunnel last after her 3 children, after 20 minutes of Nora and Gideon, guiding them through the hatch one by one in the screaming cold, and the darkness that was neither night nor day, but simply the storm's elimination of the difference. The children came easily, cold enough to be past resistance, young enough to treat an underground room as an adventure, once they understood it was warm. The oldest, a boy of 9 named Franklin, went down first and reported back up to his siblings with the brevity of someone conducting an assessment. It's warm, come down. Estelle came last. She had been in the barn long enough that the cold had worked through all her layers and found the person inside them, and she moved with the stiffness of someone whose body has spent several hours making hard decisions about which functions to maintain and which to defer. She went down the tunnel with Nora behind her, steadying her when the slope gave her difficulty. She stepped into the chamber. She stopped. The warmth was immediate and total, not the fierce targeted warmth of a fire which heats the surfaces it reaches and leaves the rest cold, but the ambient warmth of a space that is simply a different temperature than the world outside, consistently, completely, in every direction. It pressed against her skin through her layers. It pressed against her face. It was the warmth of something that had been waiting there all along, patient and indifferent, holding its 54 degrees against whatever the sky chose to do. Estelle Vance stood in it and did not speak. Her children were already on the sleeping platform, Franklin organizing the younger 2, with the bossy competence of an oldest child who has decided the situation requires management. Della had made room without being asked. Wren was explaining the finger map on the north wall to the younger Vance girl with the enthusiasm of a tour guide who has been waiting for a larger audience. Gideon sat against the east wall warming his hands. The lamp burned at full brightness. Now Nora had turned it up when the Vance children came in, because this was not a moment for rationing. Estelle looked at the walls, the ceiling, the thermometer on its hook. She looked at Nora. Her face did something complicated in the lamplight, a series of movements that were not quite any single expression, but the visible evidence of several simultaneous and contradictory realizations arriving at once. The warmth of the chamber. The sound of the storm above, distant and contained. Her children already removing outer layers because they were too warm. The thermometer reading 54 degrees with the steadiness of something that does not know how to lie. She had expected Nora understood this to find something to criticize. Some flaw in the execution, some proof that the concept was flawed. She had been carrying that expectation for 2 months, maintaining it against the evidence of her husband's careful observations and her own moment of doubt in the firelight and the answer Gideon had given her that she had chosen to walk away from. There was no flaw to find. There was only a room at 54 degrees while the world above them ran its temperature to 40 below. How? Estelle said, and then stopped because the question was too large to finish. The Earth holds its heat from the core, Nora said. Surface temperature fluctuations don't penetrate past 15 or 20 feet. At 6 feet down, the variations are minimal. At the depth of this room, the temperature is approximately the same on the coldest night in January as it is on the hottest afternoon in July. Estelle looked at the ceiling. Edmund knew this, Nora said. He wrote it down on the journey out. He had it from a man who worked mines for 20 years. We planned to build this room together eventually when we had the time and the lumber. I built it when it became the only plan left. The storm moved through something above them, a gust that even 12 feet down produced a faint shudder in the air, a brief acknowledgement of the forces at work, and then nothing. The chamber settled back into its 54-degree stillness. Estelle sat down, not with her usual deliberateness, not with the controlled placement of a woman who thinks about how she occupies space. She sat down the way people sit down when their legs have been standing for as long as legs can stand and have decided independently that the arrangement needs to change. Nora handed her a piece of dried bread in a portion of the molasses tin that Wren had been guarding as personal property, and she took it without speaking. They did not talk much those 2 days. There was not in the narrow confines of the chamber with 8 people and a lamp and the muffled sound of the worst blizzard in a decade working through its paces above them a great deal of space for the kind of conversation that the situation seemed to demand. The children created their own world on the sleeping platform, a world governed by Wren's cartographic ambitions and Franklin's organizational instincts, and the younger children's capacity to sleep through things that adults found alarming. Gideon spent those 2 days in the particular silence of a man who has done a calculation and arrived at an answer he intends to act on. Nora watched him measuring the room with his eyes. She watched him studying the ceiling construction, the door mechanism, the angle of the tunnel where it opened into the chamber. She watched him work through it systematically and arrive piece by piece at a complete understanding of how it was built. Estelle watched Nora, not with the inspection committee eyes she had brought to the surface in November, not with a judgment that had dressed itself as concern and driven up in a wagon with 2 other women to stand at the edge of the hole and find it wanting. She watched with something quieter, something that did not yet have a name, but that was, if you were patient, becoming one. On the second night, when the children were asleep and Gideon had closed his eyes against the wall, Estelle said in a voice low enough not to wake anyone, "My mother died in a winter, not like this one. An ordinary winter in Indiana in a house with a fire. The fire wasn't enough. I was 11. I have been afraid of cold ever since." Nora said nothing. "I thought being afraid of it made me understand it," Estelle said. "I thought that the people who weren't afraid of it were the ones who didn't understand it well enough." "And now?" Nora asked, a long pause. "Now I think I was afraid of the wrong thing," Estelle said. "I was afraid of the cold. I should have been afraid of not knowing what to do about it." The lamp flickered slightly, a brief variation in the burn that resolved itself and returned to steady. "The room is very warm," Estelle said. 54 degrees, Nora said. "Yes." A pause. "You must have been very sure of yourself." "I was sure of the science," Nora said. "Edmund's man was sure of it. Old Clem was sure of it. I was sure enough of them to build what they described." Estelle was quiet for a moment. "I was not kind to you," she said. "No, I was not." She stopped, started again. "I told people you were losing your mind. I organized them against you. I used their worry for their children and their discomfort with the unusual to build something that kept you isolated when you needed." She stopped again. "I didn't need anything from the settlement," Nora said. "I needed the room to work. It works." Estelle accepted this. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something more immediate than forgiveness, something that recognized that the present circumstances were what they were, and that the accounting could wait for weather more suitable to accounting. "When the storm breaks," Estelle said, "I want to learn how this was built." "I know," Nora said. "Gideon will want to build one." "I know that too. He's been measuring it with his eyes for 2 days." "I noticed." Estelle almost smiled. He's been measuring it with his eyes since October, she said. From the road. He thought I didn't know. Nora looked at her. I knew, Estelle said simply, and then she closed her eyes and in a few minutes she was asleep. The storm broke on the fifth day. Nora felt it before she heard it, a change in the quality of the pressure above a slight relaxation in whatever sustained force had been pressing against the world for the past 120 hours. Then the sound shifted, the low sustained roar dropping in register and then in volume the way a river drops after the peak of a flood, receding back toward something that was still formidable but was no longer everything. She waited 2 more hours, not impatience, patience. The patience that the room itself seemed to teach, the patience of something that holds its temperature, regardless of what is happening outside, that does not adjust its nature to accommodate the storm schedule. When she climbed the tunnel for the first time in 5 days and pushed open the upper hatch, the light that came in was extraordinary. Winter light post-storm on the Nebraska prairie is not like any other light. It has a quality of finality to it, of revelation, the world made new and terrible and pristine all at once. The snow had drifted against every vertical surface to heights that made the familiar landscape unrecognizable. The soddy was a white mound. The fence line was buried to its top rail. The sky above was a blue so deep and clear, it seemed to belong to a different planet than the one that had produced the previous 5 days. She stood in it and breathed the cold air, which was cold in the ordinary way now, serious Nebraska, January cold, nothing to dismiss, but the cold of a morning rather than the cold of an erasure. She could see smoke from some chimneys in the direction of the settlement. Not all of them. The ones that were dark, she counted them in the way that you count things you do not want to have to count, but cannot not count once you have started, were 7. 7 chimneys dark in the settlement on a morning when every chimney should have been working. She knew what some of those dark chimneys meant. Not all some might mean a family that had gone to relatives or a chimney damaged in the storm or a fire not yet relit. But some of them meant what they looked like. And she had known when she began digging in October that the winter would prove her right in a way that she would not be glad about, that the arithmetic of the storm would be paid in a currency she had no interest in collecting. She went back down and told them the storm had broken. She got the children up the tunnel, first one by one, into the blinding white of the aftermath. She got Estelle up. She got Gideon up. She stood them all in the snow outside the hatch, blinking in the extraordinary light, and watched their faces as they registered what the storm had done to the world they had left 5 days ago. The barn, Estelle said immediately. The barn is there, Gideon said. He was already oriented, already looking toward his claim. I can see the roof. When they went home to assess the damage, the children went with them, all 3 Vance's children and Nora's 2, because separation after 5 days of close quarters was not something the children were interested in negotiating. Nora let them go. She would collect Della and Wren later. She did not go to the settlement first. She went north. Old Clem's cabin was a quarter-mile away, and the drifts made it a different kind of distance. She had to navigate around the deepest accumulations, find the packed surfaces, move carefully. The cold was serious but manageable. The air was still. The prairie in every direction was white and featureless and enormous in the way it is always enormous, but that the snow made newly undeniable, stripping away every familiar marker, returning the land to what it had been before anyone decided to live on it. She found the cabin by its chimney. Dark. No smoke. She moved faster, fighting through a drift that came to her waist on the north side, getting around it, finding the door. She knocked, then opened it without waiting. The interior was cold, not the cold of a space that had been cold for long, but the cold of a fire that had gone out sometime in the night and not been relit. The stove was dark. The single window, small and north-facing, let in a blade of winter light that crossed the floor and found nothing moving. She found him outside, around the north side of the cabin, against the wall that would have given the most protection from the storm's primary direction he had dug. She almost missed it. The snow had covered everything, and what he had made was small, deliberate, and nearly invisible. A hollow in the ground, perhaps 4 feet long and 2 feet deep, cut into the earth at the base of the cabin's north wall, where the wall's heat and the earth's own temperature combined into something survivable. He had covered it with his bedroll, stretched over 2 sticks. She pulled the bedroll back. Old Clem lay inside on his back, his arms crossed over his chest, in the particular arrangement of someone who has settled in and intends to wait. His white mustache had a faint frost on it. His eyes were closed. She put her hand on his chest and felt beneath the layers of coat and flannel the movement of breathing. His eyes opened. He looked at her with the eyes that had stopped being surprised by the world a long time ago, and that showed in this moment only a calm recognition of her face, of the blue sky above, of the fact that the storm was finished and the earth had done what he had always known it would do. 52 degrees, he said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but steady. I measured it before the lamp went out. You didn't have a lamp, Nora said. I had a small one, ran through the first night. A pause. After that, it was dark, but the temperature held. She got him inside. She got the stove going. It took time, her hands working with the efficiency of someone who has spent the winter learning to do necessary things without waste. And she got him into his chair and put the blanket around him and stood back and looked at him. He was thinner than he had been. His color was not what it should be, but his eyes were clear and his breathing was evening out as the cabin warmed and the hands wrapped around the mug she had given him were shaking only slightly. The Vance family, he said. It was not a question. He was accounting for the people he knew to account for. Safe. They were in the room for the last 2 days. He nodded, absorbing this. Anyone else? I don't know yet. Some chimneys are dark. He was quiet for a moment. You did the thing right, he said. The room, I checked the angle of the tunnel the last time I came. It was right. The ceiling was right. You taught me what to fix. I told you what was wrong. You fixed it. He looked at her steadily. There is a difference and it matters. The stove was radiating heat now, filling the cabin with the ordinary warmth of burning wood, which was a different warmth than the warmth of the earth, fiercer, more directional, dependent on fuel and attention, in a way that the underground room was not. But ordinary warmth on a morning when the storm was over was a fine and sufficient thing. I'm going to need help in the spring, Nora said. Building more rooms. The Vances will want one. There are others in the settlement who will want to learn. Old Clem looked at his mug. I'll be there for the first one, he said. After that, you won't need me. I'll want you there regardless. Wanting and needing are different things. But his voice carried something in it that was not quite a smile and not quite contentment, but that occupied the same territory. You'll do fine. She sat with him for another hour until she was certain the cabin was warm enough and he was stable enough, and she could go back to the settlement and begin the accounting. He fell asleep in the chair before she left, breathing steadily, his mug still in his hands, the stove doing its work. She stood at the door and looked at him in the winter light. He had given her the angle of a tunnel and the thickness of a ceiling and the knowledge of a man who had spent 30 winters learning what the earth keeps and what it gives away. He had given her those things not out of generosity exactly, but out of the inability to pass the same information unused again, to watch the same preventable thing happen and remain silent about what he knew. She had taken what he gave her and built the rest herself. That was, she understood, the only way any of it worked. 6 families lost members in the blizzard of January 1874. Not 6 entire families, not the complete erasures she had feared when she counted the dark chimneys. 3 men who had gone out in the first hours to check on animals and had not been found until the snow melted in March. 2 elderly women whose cabins had inadequate fuel. A child of 2 whose family's fire had gone out in the night and been relit too late. The settlement would hold these losses the way communities hold losses publicly, for a season, privately for a generation. Nora did not know all of this on the morning the storm broke. She learned it piece by piece over the days that followed as the settlement dug itself out and took stock, and the full shape of the blizzard's cost became clear. She knew on that morning only that her daughters were alive and warm and were somewhere on the Vance claim helping Franklin organize the snow into structures of questionable architectural integrity. She knew that Gideon Vance was cataloging damage to his barn with the systematic efficiency of a man who has already moved from assessment to planning. She knew that the room was intact. She had gone back down into it before going to find Clem, and the thermometer had read 53 degrees, 1 degree below its usual measure, from the residual cold of 8 people having breathed the same air for 2 days, which would restore itself by evening. She knew that Estelle Vance was somewhere in her damaged cabin, dealing with the aftermath of a cracked stovepipe and a floor covered in smoke residue, and the particular inventory of a woman who has returned to her home after an absence of 5 days to discover what the storm has decided to keep and what it has chosen to take. Estelle came to her in the last week of January, alone. No wagon, no companions. On foot across the snow, which had packed enough to walk on if you chose your route carefully, which Estelle had, because Estelle Vance did everything carefully, everything deliberately, even this walk across the frozen prairie that she had been Nora understood composing herself for since the morning she climbed out of the underground room and into the post-storm light. She knocked at the soddy door. Nora let her in. They sat at the table with cups of coffee that Nora had made before she heard the knock because she had seen the figure crossing the snow from the window and known who it was and understood that this conversation required something in the hands. Estelle held her cup. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Nora. I told 12 people you were losing your mind, she said. I organized women to come and inspect your work as if you were a child playing with mud. I prayed for you in a way that was not charitable. I prevented my children from playing with your daughters during the weeks when you were working hardest and had the least support. She paused. I did all of this because I was afraid of something I didn't understand, and I chose to manage that fear by deciding you were wrong rather than by asking whether I might be. Nora held her coffee. I was wrong, Estelle said. I was wrong about the room, and I was wrong about what it meant, and I was wrong about you. My children are alive because of something you built that I spent 2 months telling anyone who would listen was foolishness. She stopped. Her hands around the cup were steady, but only from effort. I owe you more than an apology. What do you think you owe me? Nora asked. Estelle met her eyes. I want to learn to build what you built. I want Gideon to build one under our cabin before next winter, and I want to help you teach the others in the settlement who will want the same thing. A pause. I know that what I said about you traveled farther than I can call it back. I know that the best I can do with what I have left is to say plainly to whoever will listen that you were right and I was wrong, and that the room works, and that anyone who doubts it is welcome to ask me what the alternative looked like from inside a smoky barn with 3 children and the worst blizzard in 10 years working through the night above us. Nora looked at this woman who had come across the frozen prairie to sit at her table and speak plainly about the things she had done, who had not brought company or justification or the scaffolding of good intentions, who had brought only the winter-cold facts of what had happened and what it had cost. Come outside, Nora said. She took Estelle to the entrance hatch. She opened it. The cold February air rose from the tunnel. Go down, Nora said. Estelle looked at the opening. Then she went down carefully without hesitation, a different woman than the one who had stood at this same entrance in November and refused to take a single step toward it. Nora followed. In the chamber, the lamp, cold, the light coming only from the open tunnel above the temperature, was 54 degrees. Estelle stood in it and breathed it and said nothing. The first room under your cabin will take 3 weeks, Nora said. The tunnel needs to be angled correctly. Old Clem can show Gideon the right grade if Clem is well enough in the spring, and if he isn't, I can show him myself. The ceiling needs 2 feet of sod minimum. The floor needs to be raised 6 inches. I understand. You won't understand it fully until you've built one, but you'll understand it well enough to start. They stood together in the underground room while February pressed its cold against everything above them. 6 rooms, Nora said. That's what I think we can build before next winter, if we start in April. 7, Estelle said, including mine. Nora looked at her. 7. She agreed. Old Clement Purdy died in June of 1874, on a morning when the prairie was as far from winter as it ever gets green and wide, and moving with the warm wind that comes up from the south in early summer, carrying the smell of grass and the sound of the meadowlarks that fill the silence between settlements with something that is not human, but is not lonely either. He died in his cabin in his chair, which was where Nora had last seen him, and which seemed right, the chair by the stove, the view of the eastern horizon through the small window, the thermometer hanging on its nail, where it had always hung and where it would stay for as long as the cabin stood. She was with him at the end. She had visited every 2 weeks through the winter and spring, and she had known for the last month that the end was coming, not dramatically, not painfully, but with the gradual ease of someone who has decided they have finished what they came to do and is taking their time about the leaving. He said 2 days before, the room held all winter, she said, and through 2 more small storms in February. Temperature, 54 every time. He nodded. He looked out the window for a while. There's a family in Kansas, he said, name of Beaumont. They asked me once about the underground room. I told them about it, but I was passing through and I didn't have time to see it done properly. Give me the name, Nora said. Beaumont, east of Dodge City on the Cimarron River. They'll find you if you write to the land office there. She wrote it down. He closed his eyes. On the last morning, he was simply gone. The way things go that have been present for so long, their absence takes a moment to register the way the wind stops sometimes, and the grass stands still, and the world is briefly quieter than it knows how to be. Nora stood at the door of his cabin and looked east at the horizon he had always seemed to be regarding, and she thought about the hollow in the creek bank in 1864, and the family name Pruitt, and the angle of a tunnel that had to be corrected, and the thermometer on its nail that had read 52 degrees through 4 days of the worst blizzard in a generation. She thought about what you pass on when you pass something on, not just the information itself, but the weight of what it costs to learn it, the specific gravity of knowledge earned through loss. She had received that from him. She would carry it into everything she built going forward. The claim was certified in the land office on the 22nd of March, 1874, 10 days before the deadline Silas Brandt had given her, because Nora Whitfield had learned in the last 6 months that deadlines are not targets, but limits, and that finishing before the limit is simply what competence looks like. 160 acres. Nebraska prairie, hers. She stood outside the land office in the March cold with the certified document in her hand and looked at it for a long time. Edmund's name was crossed out in the original filing, and hers written in clean and legal and permanent in the hand of a clerk who had done this transaction without any particular interest in the story behind it, who had simply recorded what the law allowed. She thought about the rented room in St. Paul, the maps on the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, Edmund's finger tracing the boundaries of the land they would have together, his voice careful and specific about the future they were building toward. She had the land. She had built what he wrote down. She had kept the daughters he had carried across 2 states safe through the winter that would have killed them in any of the alternatives. The land was hers. The room below it was hers. The future she had made from the ruin of the future they had planned together was improbably and completely, and by every legal and practical measure available, hers. She drove home in the March wagon with a document in Edmund's saddlebag, which she had repaired in the fall, the brass buckle replaced with one that worked. The prairie was beginning its spring. Not dramatically spring on the Nebraska prairie is not dramatic in its arrival. It is tentative and incremental. The green coming back into the grass, slowly the sky lifting by degrees, the light returning, in the way that northern light returns, with a quality of restoration rather than arrival. But it was there. The process was underway. She stopped the wagon at the edge of her claim. Della and Wren were with her. They went to town with her, now both of them, because the settlement had rearranged its relationship to the Whitfield family over the winter in ways that made the things that had been said in October feel like the statements of a different season, which they were. She looked at her land, the soddy, the woodpile, the small corral and the animals, the garden plot she had staked out on the south side in the fall where the soil was dark and the light was long in the afternoon. The place where the tunnel entrance was the hatch invisible beneath its covering of sod, the underground room holding its temperature below, regardless of what March was doing above. Della climbed down from the wagon without being asked and walked to the edge of the garden plot and looked at it with the careful assessment of someone who has watched her mother assess things for 6 months and absorbed the method. Wren walked directly to the tunnel hatch, lifted it, and looked down into the darkness. Still warm, she announced, though she could not have felt it from the surface, though it was more declaration than observation, though it was the statement of a child who has decided that something is true and sees no reason to keep checking it. Nora stayed on the wagon for a moment longer. She looked at the entrance to the underground room that had been madness in October and salvation in January, and was now simply part of the land, a feature of it, as natural as the shallow draw to the north, or the line of cottonwoods along the eastern edge. Something that belonged here. Something that had always been here, in principle, waiting for someone to understand what the earth already knew. 6 feet down, it was 54 degrees. It had been 54 degrees before she arrived, and it would be 54 degrees long after she was gone, and everything that happened between those 2 points, the digging and the building and the blizzard, and the 8 people in the dark, and the 7 new rooms going up before next winter, and the document in the saddlebag with her name written clean and permanent, All of it had happened because she had been willing to go beneath the surface of things, to go down into the earth and find what was stable there, to trust what the ground knew over what the air insisted. She climbed down from the wagon. She walked to where Della stood at the garden plot and put her hand on her daughter's shoulder and looked at the dark soil which was beginning to soften at the surface as March worked on it. Behind her, Wren had climbed down into the tunnel entrance up to her waist and was narrating something to no one in particular about the quality of the air below. Nora did not call her back. The earth was 54 degrees, 6 feet down, the same as it had been on the day she started digging, the same as it would be on the 1st of April, when the wildflowers started coming back across the prairie, the same as it would be in the July heat, and the next January blizzard, and every season after that. It did not know about the document in the saddlebag. It did not know about the 6 families who had lost people, or the 7 rooms that were going up before next winter, or the name Beaumont in Kansas that she had written down and would write to when the spring work allowed. It knew only what it had always known, its own temperature, its own patience, its own indifference to what the sky chose to do. She had gone down into it and listened to it, and it had kept her. That was enough. That had always been enough.